Tyreek Hill wants out of Miami. And after having 2 seasons in which he averaged 1,700 yards, Tyreek Hill had a disappointing third season in Miami. He got less than 1,000 yards. He got significantly less targets that he had been accustomed to. And he also played 6 games without quarterback Tua Tagovailoa due to injuries to the starting quarterback. So add it all up, in addition to missing the playoffs, and it's probably Tyreek Hill's most disappointing season as a professional. And in the heat of the moment after a disappointing loss to the Jets, Tyreek Hill, without much time to reflect, kind of voiced his displeasure about the organization and him wanting to leave and do what's best for his career and do what's best for his family and reevaluating his situation in Miami, even saying that, he wants out. So we'll see how that plays out in terms of when temperatures cool, when players are able to, get a chance to really reflect on their season and reflect on their future. Then you can have an idea of where they stand with the organization and also where the organization stands with Tyreek Hill. But on the surface, it looks very bad from the perspective that the Dolphins just gave Tyreek Hill new guaranteed money when he wasn't on the books for any guaranteed money in 2025 and 2026. So the team had him on the contract, but they gave him the guaranteed money, I guess, in good faith that they were committed to him and this nucleus of players going into the future. So, from Tyreek's perspective, you can understand his frustration, but he's not the first player to ever be frustrated after a disappointing season. As far as the organization is concerned, Mike McDaniel has to be very careful how he proceeds going forward with Tyreek Hill. Now, it's a situation where, both sides can come together and as men find a way to hash it out so that they could go into 2025 together on the same page. And maybe it might require Mike McDaniel to change his philosophy on offense and stop depending on the quick passing game as much as he has and try to get the ball to his top receiver, even in two deep shell coverages, because other teams seem to do it. Jamar Chase sees two deep zones all the time, and Joe Burrow gets him the ball. Now, if Tyreek Hill's mind is made up and he decides that he wants to be out, then, it kind of goes back to what Mike Tomlin says, right? I mean, you need volunteers, not hostages. And the Dolphins don't need to keep Tyreek Hill a hostage if he doesn't want to be there. They have to find a trade partner to get him off of the roster and find a way to get as much value as they can from him and then see if they can move forward with the pieces they have in place. Perhaps replace his position with somebody that's, somewhat on his level of talent. The Dolphins have to make sure they do this right because they can't afford to botch this up like they've done other deals in the past. The Dolphins have to make sure they get as much value for Tyreek Hill if they decide to trade him. And if they do, they have to make sure that they just can't let talented players go without replacing them. They need to get adequate replacements for them. We saw this issue when the Dolphins lost Christian Wilkins. They didn't really get an adequate replacement until Calais Campbell jumped on board late in the offseason. Then we saw the same thing too with Robert Hunt. He was a fantastic talent on the offensive line, overpriced, but still a talented player that they didn't really replace a player of his caliber, and it hurt the team. So you just can't get rid of Tyreek Hill and what he does for the offense, even if he's not getting the ball. He's very important in terms of stretching the defense and having those two deep shells, which allows Devon Achane and Jonnu Smith to get the ball underneath all the time. So Tyreek Hill has value to the team, even if he's not catching the football. But you just can't get rid of that talent and decide not to replace it with someone comparable. So the Dolphins have to be really careful here because if they don't replace Tyreek Hill's talent and they just get rid of him for some middling draft picks, then the Dolphins have a real chance of having this thing really implode on them in 2025. And I'm a person who believes that you try to keep talented players on your team as much as possible. And when I say talented, I mean players who are elite. And it's hard to replace an elite talent in the NFL. Other teams just don't normally get rid of them. But the Dolphins have to do the best they can to manage the situation because Without Tyreek Hill, now we're talking about Tua's effectiveness, and giving Tua a $53 million contract without having a guy like Tyreek Hill on the field can be something that they may not get the return on that investment either. So they have to be very careful how they navigate these waters, because it can have a real impact for the 2025 season. When the Dolphins gave Jalen Waddle a new contract before the 2024 regular season, I thought that it made sense, considering that other wide receivers of his ilk, guys like Devontae Smith, got a new deal. Guys like T. Higgins were supposed to get a new deal, or at least he was due for one. He didn't get one. I think he's played under the tag this year. So those guys, number two wide receivers or number 1B wide receivers, those guys were starting to get paid. And if you waited longer to pay Jalen Waddle, then he would have cost more in the future. So the Dolphins wanted to get ahead of it. They could have kept him on the 5th-year option, but they decided to get ahead of it to save money in future years. And it made sense for the franchise to make that kind of move. But at the time, I questioned, what does that mean for Tyreek Hill's role on the team in the future? As a receiver who is about to go into his 30s at the time, in going into the regular season, you got to figure that the Dolphins can't have two wide receivers making that much money, right? They had Jalen Waddle in the deal that was averaging about 20 million a year. You have Tyreek Hill in the deal that's averaging about 30 million. So that's like $50 million tied up in two wide receivers. And I didn't think that that would be sustainable for building a team. Very rarely do you see a team that's built that way. Yeah, Philadelphia has AJ Brown and Devontae Smith, and there are a couple of other teams that have expensive wide receiver tandems, but I don't think that that model is necessarily one that's conducive to success. And Philadelphia, they have an extraordinary offensive line. They have a quarterback who's able to pick up third and fourth and shorts. And now they just acquired a running back in Saquon Barkley in the offseason that basically put their running game over the top. So, they have a very unique situation where they have an extremely talented offense. And the fact that they could get two expensive wide receivers on the books for the type of talent that they have on that offense is really just extraordinary work by Howie Roseman and the Philadelphia front office. But the Dolphins haven't built that kind of offensive line and that kind of offense. So, it doesn't seem that it would make sense for them to spend that much on wide receiver when you really don't have your trenches really bolstered to be a dominant team, both passing the ball and running the ball. The Dolphins did it, though. The Dolphins did decide to pay their two top wide receivers. And, for the most part, the Dolphins didn't get much return on that investment. You look at the stats for Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill throughout the course of the season, and they completely underperformed compared to last season and even the season before that. And some of that has to do with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle not having Tua Tagovailoa for 4 games due to Tua's concussion, and then 2 games due to Tua's hip injury, right? The backup quarterbacks haven't been good enough. But if you're a wide receivers that's getting paid that much, you would expect them to be quarterback proof, right? As best as you possibly can. You would expect them to be so dominant that they would be able to lift even mediocre quarterbacks. Guys like Justin Jefferson is playing with Sam Darnold this year. Last year, he played with guys like Joshua Dobbs, and he also played with Nick Mullins. And, Justin Jefferson still got his. So if you're an elite wide receiver and you're getting paid that much money, you're supposed to be somewhat quarterback proof. And again, I'm not saying any quarterback, right? I mean, there's some quarterbacks like Skylar Thompson that showed us this year that is just not really up for the challenge, right? So there's at least a bare minimum that you have to do as a quarterback in order to get the ball to these wide receivers. But the Dolphins haven't been able to do that. And as a result of their poor backup quarterback play, they haven't gotten good return on investment for these two wide receivers. So the Dolphins really have to make sure that they do this correctly so that they could not only maximize the value of their salary cap, but also that they can keep their players and coaches on the same page and keep the locker room in harmony. So this is going to be difficult for Mike McDaniel. and Chris Greer, but somehow they have to make sure they navigate it the right way. So that's it for this episode. If you like this episode, hit the like button and also leave a comment in the section below. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.